I have something here for you tonight that is it kind of flitted through my mind when I heard about the horror the other day, the Chattanooga shootings. It kind of flitted through my mind, but I don't know. I didn't seize on it at the time, and it took Glenn Greenwald, writing at The Intercept, to bring it up again. And he points out that attack was instantly and widely declared by U.S. media to be terrorism. And an FBI official announced at the press briefing that they had that the U.S. or the FBI will treat this as a terrorism investigation until it can be determined it was not. Well, I think that's already been determined, terrorism. Now, as Greenwald points out, the word terrorism in U.S. political and media discourse means little beyond violence by Muslims against the West. And that's very self-evident, and there's no reason discussing it. That's what they mean these days by terrorism. And as Greenwald points out, he's documented many times, most recently, a couple of weeks ago, when that term was steadfastly not applied to the white racist terrorist who went into a black church in Charleston and murdered 8 people. And the killer in that instance, was it 9 people? I'm sorry. The killer in that instance had definite political and sociological motives. It's all over his Facebook, his webpage, whatever. We know what he was. We know what he was doing. He was a terrorist, but that word was never used. So Greenwald says, I want to focus on a narrow question about that term, terrorism. Can it apply to violent attacks that target military sites and soldiers of a nation at war rather than civilians? He writes, in common usage, as opposed to legal definitions, terrorism typically connotes, if not denotes, violence against civilians. If you ask most people why they regard the attacks in this country on September 11, 2001, as so singularly atrocious, you'll likely hear that it was because the violence was aimed indiscriminately at civilians. And if you ask them to distinguish why they regard civilian killing U.S. violence as legitimate when we do it and justified, but regard the violence in the United States against civilians as terrorism, they'll likely claim that the U.S. only kills civilians by accident, not on purpose. Now, whether one is targeting civilian versus military sites is a central aspect of how we talk about the justifiability of violence and what is not terrorism. Let's take this a little bit further when we come back. 21 past the hour. So Glenn Greenwald is trying to show a semantic distinction that should be pointed out, and how it's being misused in this global war on terror that we apparently are involved in and will be involved in until the end of civilization. As Greenwald points out, increasingly in the West, violent attacks are aimed at purely military targets, yet they're still being called terrorism. And in fact, many people even now are indignant that Nidal Hassan was not formally charged with terrorism for his attack on the U.S. military base at Fort Hood, Texas, even though the media did refer to him as a terrorist. And last October in Canada, a few weeks after that government announced it would bomb Iraq against ISIS, a Muslim man waited for hours in his car in a parking lot until he saw 2 Canadian soldiers in uniform, and then he ran over, killing one. That was universally denounced as terrorism, despite his obvious targeting of soldiers. Omar Khadr was sent to Guantanamo as a teenager and branded a terrorist for killing a U.S. soldier fighting the war in Afghanistan. One of the more notorious so-called terrorism prosecutions in the U.S. involved an alleged plot to attack the military base at Fort Dix. Trumpeted terror arrests in the U.S. now often involve plots against military rather than civilian targets. And the 9/11 attack itself targeted the Pentagon in addition to the World Trade Center, just to establish. Now, as Greenwald points out, the argument that even attacks on military bases should be regarded as terrorism rests on the proposition that soldiers who are not actively engaged in combat when attacked are not legitimate targets. Instead, it is legitimate only to target them when engaging them on a battlefield. Under the law of war, one cannot, for instance, legally hunt down soldiers while they're sleeping in their homes or playing with their children or buying groceries at a supermarket. You know where this is going, don't you? Their mere status as soldiers does not mean it is legally permissible to target and kill them wherever they are found. It is only permissible to do so on the battlefield when they are engaged in combat. You really know where this is going, don't you? Now, it's extremely difficult to understand how anyone who supports U.S. military actions by us and their allies under the so-called war of terror rubric can possibly advance that view with a straight face. The official framework that drives the West's military behavior is the exact antithesis of that legal and moral standard. When it comes to justifying their own violence, the U.S. and their allies have spent the last 15 years insisting on precisely the opposite view. Wherever they are, that's where we target them. In a car with their family, at a family reunion, at a wedding, in their houses asleep with 30 other people, kill them. Other people get killed, too bad. And as Greenwald points out, the U.S. drone program constantly targets individuals regarded as illegal combatants and kills them without the slightest regard for where they are, what they're doing at the moment, in their homes, in their sleep, driving a car. The U.S. often targets people without even knowing their names or identities based on their behavioral patterns, right? What was that rule in Afghanistan or Iraq? It got to the point where if 7 or 8 or 3 or 4 men, Iraqi men of a certain age, were seen clustered on a street corner, they were obviously planning terror attack, kill them all. Isn't that what got Chelsea Manning in a whole lot of trouble? Showing those videos, releasing those videos. Now, the justification for all this is that these are enemy combatants and they therefore can be legitimately targeted and killed no matter where they are found or what they're doing at the time. And the U.S. government, under Bush and Obama, has officially adopted that view.